Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Q4 Kenshoo Quarterly Trends webinar. Before we get started, I want to go through a couple of housekeeping notes. On the webinar itself, we are using GoToWebinar, and all attendees should be in listen-only mode. If you start talking, I will not be able to hear you. However, you can submit questions via the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can also download some of the materials that we're talking about in the handouts section on the panel. If you're having sound issues, you can join the webinar via telephone or your computer and speakers. And if you have any problems, my colleague Michelle Irwin is standing by at michelle.irwin@kenshoo.com if you're having any trouble. So with all that, I am your host. My name is Chris Costello. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing Research here at Kenshoo. You can reach me at that email. You can, if you want more background, that's my LinkedIn. And because everyone gives their Twitter, that's my Twitter. Although I will warn you, the last thing I tweeted were alternate lyrics to Bon Jovi's, or retweeted was alternate lyrics to Bon Jovi's Living on a Prayer. So anyway, here's what we're going to talk about today. We'll start with a little bit about the methodology. We will go through some high-level industry insights. We'll talk a little bit about the holidays as well. Then kind of the core bread and butter of the trends, and that's just the overall trends across search and social. We'll speak a little bit about emerging channels, and then again, at the end, we will try to answer some of your questions. For this report, we are introducing a slight change to our methodology. We had been going on a 5-quarter basis with a little bit of a difference between the top half and the bottom half of spenders. What we're doing now is we are playing it a little more strictly same store, and we're doing it on a monthly basis rather than quarterly basis. And then we're also trying to filter out some advertisers based on kind of more market behavior, or not market behavior, more non-market behavior. If, say, an agency is ramping up on our platform or ramping down, we don't want to include that because it's more about the relationship between Kenshoo and the agency than about the market in general. And the reasons we're doing that is to put things more in line with that same store industry standard that we're used to seeing. It lessens the impact of those agency relationships. And ultimately, from my point of view, I'm always trying to tame the long tail of advertisers, which is kind of why we were doing things the way we were doing before. Trying to apply the same type of model to both search and social. As a result of that, we've got data crossing. You can see the publishers here that we're working off of. It's from October 2016 through December 2017. Again, 5 full quarters of data. That gives us over 500 billion impressions, 14 billion clicks, and northwards of $6.5 billion in advertiser spend. That said, we're not going to put actual values in terms of volume on the charts. For most of those charts, we will normalize those so they're indexed from 1 to whatever. So if you went up 60%, it'll be 1.6. So you can see growth that way. Any financial metrics, any cost-based metrics, we do adjust for exchange rates, which means we keep it in the native currency until we analyze it, and then we convert at that point. So this way you can filter out the impact of currency fluctuations. So first, let's talk about the high-level industry insights. One of the subjects we've been tracking over time, those of you who've been on these calls before are familiar with how this goes. It's video on the social side. So here we see that spending on social and video really kind of jumped up. You see that blue line going, kind of angling up at the right from Q3 to Q4. We saw a 57% increase quarter over quarter for that spending and a 93% growth year over year. And as for a share of total social spending, we saw it peak up around 25% in Q1 of 2017, and now we're back at that level. So approximately 1 out of every $4 spent in social right now is going to a video ad. Another area, and also very visual, and I'm kind of giving away the common thread we're going to talk about in a second, is Instagram. Instagram had a big kind of big quarter-over-quarter growth. We're going to see this on a couple different splits of the data on the social side. And we see 183% year-over-year growth. We see, if you look at the blue bars here, a sharp rise from Q3 to Q4 as well, and clicks growing nearly 4 times in the same period. So the engagement levels with Instagram ads has been increasing over time. And this is, as Instagram is a somewhat new advertising channel, works out its kinks, it's figuring out better ways to get those Instagram users to interact with some of these ad units that are going up on their service. Back on the search side, if we look at shopping campaigns, and if we look at them specifically by device, overall shopping campaigns grew 34% year over year in terms of spending. But mobile search shopping campaigns drove that by about a 3-to-1 ratio. So every $3 of growth on, or for every $1 of growth on the desktop, we got approximately $3 of growth on mobile shopping campaigns on the search side. So that's kind of, we've talked a lot about how mobile and product on their own have been big drivers of search growth, but as we will see, when you combine them together, it really kind of takes off. One of the other things we have been tracking over time has been the search migration of expanded text ads. This was mandated by Google and later by Bing, where you need to basically relaunch a lot of your campaigns in this new, enhanced, more visually appealing, visually consistent format across that brings kind of consistency across the desktop and mobile environment. And by now we've gotten up to 80% of search clicks migrated to the new format. So good job on, getting the thing done that you have to do. We have seen here, you can look at click-through rate for those ETA ads compared to legacy ads, and there's been a consistent gap between them. And the ETA ads have better click-through rates pretty much from the get-go compared to legacy ads. Now, some of this can be the format and the layout itself. If you think about what the expanded text ad does, it makes you rethink about what your ad copy was to begin with. So anytime that you rev your copy, you're going to see positive effects typically. And more transparency with the URL. There are many things that make this a somewhat more clickable format. But also another factor here is that the best practice, as kind of explained by the publishers, is that when you're migrating your whole program over, you're typically going to start with the good stuff. You're going to start migrating your better performing campaigns first. So the bucket of expanded text ads is going to be kind of by definition both higher CTR and maybe higher CPC as well. So it's a combination of those two things that you start to see that gap. Once we reach 100% or very close to 100%, that's when we can really kind of tease out what the performance impact of the format itself is. So we look forward to everyone finishing their homework and migrating all of their text ads over to the expanded text format. So what's common between a lot of these formats where we see such growth and we see kind of big movement year over year, particularly the social video, Instagram, mobile search shopping campaigns? What do they have in common? And that's visuals. Here I've got an example from mobile shopping versus desktop shopping. And if you look on the left, a search for Fender Stratocaster, you see your shop for Fender Stratocaster, you see those 5 ads there, but it's really, like what, maybe 20% of the entire screen real estate here. There are some, and then there's some other regular search ads as well. Whereas on the right, the visuals take up a bigger piece of the user experience. You can't overlook that. That's like a third of the entire screen now has those 3 ads. And that is going to help drive a more immersive experience. And in the cases of some of these types of ads, we'll see it with, the dynamic product ads for social as well. We'll see it with Pinterest even. It just gives you more to do and more to encourage that engagement and interaction. We've seen Instagram getting better at this over time already. Video might be the one that kind of bucks that trend, but video is primarily a passive watching format. So that's kind of the high level on search and social things that are happening in and of themselves. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit is the holidays. We just got through 2017. We got through what have been called the Cyber Five, which is Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Cyber Monday. So if we take the holiday season and break it down by kind of three primary periods, we look at the Cyber Five, those 5 days I just talked about, the week directly before Christmas. And with last year Christmas being on a Sunday and this year it being on a Monday, we can kind of get away with it. If it's kind of further in the week, you might get some weird effects based on ability to shop or pick up in store and that kind of thing. But anyway, if you break it down into those three big chunks, and if you look at year over year same store sales, you see that social ad spending really, really grew during that Cyber Five period between Thanksgiving and Cyber Monday. That was really the big difference between last year and this year. A lot of that's going to be driven by increased adoption of dynamic ads for products, which is another topic we've talked about in the past, and that we will get into a little bit further down. We saw great success with DPA last year, and so then you have advertisers who did it last year are going to do more of it, and advertisers who saw other advertisers do well with it are going to do it this year. So those types of ads tend to get very focused around this Cyber Five period because there's so much shopping activity. So it's not really that surprising that that's where social kind of picked up the most mojo. What's interesting is that search actually saw the most growth the week before Christmas. I don't know what to make of that other than, I don't know if it's a function of procrastination and kind of the customer shopping process of getting things in front of people when they're in a shopping mindset, and then when they're actually, when the rubber hits the road in a lot of ways. But we did see a bit of a difference there. The other interesting thing is that period in between, that post-Thanksgiving, pre-Christmas period, was the lowest growth of the three. So in both cases, in both the search and social case, the spending increases are very focused on kind of the peak periods that are about actual shopping behavior and not necessarily an externally driven, this is when we say the season is. So from a behavioral point of view, that's kind of encouraging that it's based a little more on the actual consumer behavior than anything that's being forced upon them. On a similar note, people who have known me for a long time know that I like railing against Cyber Monday as kind of a slightly artificial thing. You can look at our blog. I wrote something about a month ago that digs into this in excruciating detail. But at the end of the day, Cyber Monday is still the biggest day overall for online e-commerce spending. But it's not quite so universal anymore. Typically, it's search keywords that we see driving this behavior. But if you break it down, if you tease out social and if you tease out shopping campaigns, social actually had a bigger Black Friday than Cyber Monday, because Black Friday has always been the day that people actually shop. Cyber Monday kind of happened because they were looking at stuff over the weekend and they got back to high-speed connections on Monday. Now we've all got broadband and 4G and whatnot, so that's less of a limiting factor. So that's one interesting piece. Keyword search, still Cyber Monday, so people are searching, and I think a lot of that is getting back to your desk, getting back to work when you're sitting in front of a computer and you kind of have that time to actually look for things. And then for shopping campaigns, it's kind of flat. It's kind of an even split between Black Friday and Cyber Monday. So it would not surprise me in the future to start to see things kind of tack back towards Black Friday and away from Cyber Monday over time. Hasn't happened yet, but it still might. So that's just a little bit about the holidays. Now we're going to get into, again, the bread and butter of the trends that we've seen, and we're going to start here with social in Q4 2017, not 2018. Sorry about that. I can dock my pay for that later. The highlights of what we saw for social was a drop, and we'll get to the numbers in a second. there's a drop in social impressions. And if you were on the call last quarter, you'll know that this was driven primarily by a sharp decrease in low priced, low click-through rate desktop ad units. So we see more of that by removing those low click-through ads, and along with kind of increases we've seen in things like carousel ads, clicks and click-through rate are both pretty much the highest we've seen over the last 5 quarters. And then that decrease, again, in impressions, it kind of ripples through a lot of other metrics. It has a big influence in the year-over-year change in CPM, which looks particularly high when everything's thrown in together, but then it's really only probably about 13% when that desktop inventory is left out. And now I'll show you what I mean by that. So here you see a 5% decrease overall in impressions, while a 73% increase year over year in clicks from Q4 last year to Q4 this year. And then overall spending, we saw that, quarter over quarter jump of about 38%, and then year over year 39% growth in social spending across the entire sample. So pretty consistent on a year over year basis with what we've been seeing. Given what we saw in the Cyber 5 period, we might have expected that number to grow a little bit over that kind of 40% range that we've been tracking. But at the same time, e-commerce is maybe less of a piece of the overall social ecosystem than it is in search. And also, that was a very localized spike. So it didn't really drive things up at the overall level as much as some might expect it. I would not have been surprised to have seen higher growth, but we didn't, and I'm okay with that. Going back to those click-through rate and CPM metrics, you see, big increases year over year on both of them. You see 83% on click-through rate and 47% on CPM. And on the surface, you can say, wow, things are getting much more expensive and much more engaging. That's not entirely the story. Both of these metrics are very heavily affected by what seem to be structural changes in the Facebook desktop ad inventory that went down early last year. So a bit of a refresher. We talked about this last quarter if you were on the call there. If you look at that bottom part of the bar, the green section of the bar, and you see those desktop right-hand column ads. And from Q1 of last year to Q4, you see them just kind of dwindle away to nothing. This looks like an inventory change to me. I have not been able to go back and find any formal declaration of it. If it's not a straight, hey, we're changing the layout of the desktop page decision, one of the things we kind of have speculated is that as advertisers start to get away from reach-driven campaigns, if you're not looking to optimize on reach, if you're looking for CPC or cost per acquisition, then the fact that those are less engaging ad units in the first place means that you're just by virtue of the optimization, you're going to move away from them. So it could have been a formal a priori change, if that's the right way to, sorry, expensive education. I'm trying to remember how to use those words. Let's say if it happened before and it was planned, or if it's something that just kind of the behavior kind of drove. Either way, the effect is the same. We see fewer impressions of this type. And because they're low CTR and low CPM, it's going to ripple through a bunch of all these other metrics. And so it's important to keep that in your mind when you're looking at those changes. So if you see a big CPM change, it's not that, oh my God, the ads that are left got more expensive by this much. It's like, well, they might have, but it's not just that. And we'll get into that a little more. Here you can look at it by kind of the 5 big divisions of placements in the social world. And you can see that the desktop right-hand column is the bottom line here. And you can see it's lower than everything else. These are the lowest CPM units that exist. Meanwhile, you've got the mobile feed, which is the purple line, is kind of the core of the social advertising experience. And you see that CPM has been much more stable. The other interesting thing, and we're not going to really dig into it this time, but the fact that it's now on our radar means we'll look at it more in the future, is that top line. And that's the desktop feed excluding right-hand column. So this is like the rest of desktop. And we see that in A, it's very expensive, and B, it's been increasing faster than some of these other areas. I don't know why that is yet, but it's fascinating to me. And if we just looked at desktop by itself, that top line and that bottom line would even out to be something that was kind of in the middle with the other stuff. So by doing this, we're able to identify that, hey, this is something we want to drill down into and kind of figure out more. So stay tuned. If we come up with something before 3 months from now, we may post it to the blog, or we'll try to dig into it in the next quarterly review. So now what happens if you take those out? If you remove them from the CPM trend, you can see that, okay, it's still increasing. That's the blue line now, going from just under $6 to about, 6.5, a little over 6.5. It's also much more stable over time. CPM is only a 9% increase quarter over quarter and a 13% year over year compared to that very much more dramatic 47% when all placements are included. So one of the things when we see big CPM increases, given some of the things that Facebook has said about ad load, we start to think, oh my God, we're hitting the top of ad load and CPMs are skyrocketing. That's not really what's happening here, or this is not evidence of that happening. So something to keep in mind when we look at social impression pricing. Now, if we do the same thing for click-through rate, we get a fairly similar line. It, note for note, it doesn't really change that much of the trend. It kind of moves it up a little bit because those low click-through rates are excluded, but we're still seeing a 10% growth in click-through rate compared to last quarter and 40% compared to last year. Now, in this case, one of the things that we've talked about is the increase in carousel ads on social. And these are multiple clickable assets within the ad unit. So they tend to drive a lot of interactions by their nature. And that is one of the reasons we see these social click-through rates climbing even once we take out the ads that don't have high click-through rates. So in trying to visualize this and summarize this, I first kind of looked at it and said, what if I just look at the percent difference of the volume of impressions, the share of impressions, the percent difference in CPM year over year and in click-through rate. And the result is kind of, you can see that desktop right-hand column ads drop by, 75% or so, both in terms of share and volume. But the rest of this chart is kind of an unholy mess. So we're not going to consider this chart. We're going to come up with a better way to look at it, and that is with bubble charts. So what you see here now is your x-axis is your CPM of the type of the placement of the ad. Your y-axis is the click-through rate, and the size of the bubble is the relative size of that segment. And as an added bonus, it kind of carries through from left to right on the two different periods that you see here. So the total on the total bubble on the right is 5% smaller than the total bubble on the left, because if you remember back to one of our earlier slides, total impressions decreased by 5%. So that scales all the things. I will be holding Excel tutorials after the conclusions of this call, so we can go over how you do these fun little visualizations. But you can see what you can see when you do this, when you go from the 2016 to the 2017 data, is that those right-hand column ads were acting as kind of this, they had a gravitational pull on the total, on your overall CPM and your overall click-through rate. So once that got smaller, moving from the left to the right, you see that kind of frees the overall piece to move further to the right and further up. So your overall CPM increased and your overall click-through rate increased. You see some other movement as well. We see that desktop feed CPM increase that we talked about previously. We see the mobile feed increase in click-through rate without increasing that much in terms of CPMs. So that's an interesting finding as well that we wouldn't necessarily have seen without this way of looking at the data. And you see Instagram getting bigger. You see mobile feed getting bigger as well. So in terms of overall volume, those are some of the areas where we see impression growth year over year. Now that we've introduced this way of looking at things, we can apply this visualization to what we consider kind of the key segments of the channel. Those categories do not need to be mutually exclusive because we're looking at the size of the bubble as a percent of total. It still kind of holds up. If you've got, 60% of your ads are mobile, and just as a hypothetical example, 70% are product ads, they'll just be size relative to each other, and they don't necessarily add up to make the whole, but that's fine with this visualization. Or for example, mobile ads can be video ads, but you want to consider them as a separate segment. So we can kind of get a sense of where things are going. And so this gives us that single view of kind of the three of the key things that we track when we dig into these data sets, and that's how has spending volume changed, how has pricing changed, and how has click-through rate, engagement level changed. So when we do that for kind of the key social segments, with the bubble size being the spending volume now, you see again CPM versus click-through rate, and you see the bubbles as the size of the market. You see mobile is clearly the biggest segment of social ads, even in Q4 of 2016, but you see in 2017, it's almost kind of one-to-one. It's getting much, much closer to being the definition of social ads is the same as mobile ads in a lot of different ways. You see video getting much bigger, and you see CPMs increasing a bit there. Same thing, Instagram, CPMs kind of holding a bit, but you see the size of that get bigger. And dynamic product ads are interesting in that they've gotten a bigger chunk of spending clearly, but they've not really moved much in terms of their overall CPM. So there's a lot of information packed into this slide. You do have the ability to download these slides, so I encourage you to look at it a little closer. And if you have questions, I may be able to address them at the end as well. So drilling into a couple of these subjects that we looked at, one of was dynamic ads, and dynamic ads for products in particular. There are dynamic ads for other areas like travel and some other things. But for the time being, when I'm talking about these, I'm talking about the e-commerce heavy direct response ad, and we're calling those DPAs, even though it doesn't match up with the actual title anymore. Anyway, the number of accounts, this is what I spoke to earlier. We saw a 44% increase in the number of accounts that are using these ad types. And you see that here in the chart. So if you remember back to how we constructed the sample, this is all same store now. So that means they were spending on social, but they weren't spending on DPA, and now they are. And that accounts for about 23% of the year-over-year growth from new entrants into the space. And for this is now 2 years and change, probably like maybe 2.5 years the DPA has been a thing. That's still pretty robust growth from new entrants to using this ad type. And as Facebook extends this model into other types and other areas, we're going to see a little bit more. We'll see how this plays out in, for example, travel or real estate or some of the other areas that they're using the dynamic ad format. Another drill down here is on the video side. We showed something like this a couple of quarters ago, but I wanted to refresh it and look at the year-over-year change in the share of spending for video by industry here, and the change in that from year over year. And the main thrust of this is that video ads aren't just for branding. They're not just for media and entertainment, they're still very much for gaming. You look at the share of gaming ads that's coming from video, it's very, very large. But you also see, significant growth from 2016 to 2017 in e-commerce, in finance, and in travel, areas that are a little typically somewhat different in how they're trying to reach their customers on social. And you might not have thought that video was the way they were going to go, particularly somebody like e-commerce that's so focused on direct response, travel kind of the same way, but it's really kind of taking off. And with finance, if we look at the year over year actual spending, it increased by a factor of like 7. and e-commerce and travel both increased by like a factor of 3. So we're seeing a lot more, let's call it democratization of social video across industries. That concludes the social portion of the program. We can, again, if you've got questions, you can ask using the user panel. I will not be looking at them until we get to the Q&A part. So if it's something that is kind of an all stop, I'm sorry, you may have to be a little patient. Now we're going to get into search, which is again for Q4 2017. I can't catch every little typo. The search highlights, and again, we'll get into the numbers after we go through kind of the bullet points. Mobile shopping campaigns were the biggest driver, hands down, of both impression and click growth, and they're now the largest share of impressions across all of paid search. Lots of people getting eyeballs on shopping ads on their phones. Also, you know, the old faithful desktop keyword search, CPCs actually grew by about 5% compared to last year, which bucks the overall CPC trend and led to a 1% increase in year-over-year spend for the old standard bearer of the search world. Now, some of that with CPCs and even click-through rates, we would think is that differential that we're seeing from ETAs, because those are higher CPC and they're making up a larger percent of the total. That's going to kind of give upward pressure on both the CPC number and the overall growth trend. And the other thing about the mobile shopping campaigns, getting back to that, is that while they're the fastest growing segment, they also have relatively low CPCs compared to other devices and ad types. And so when we look at the overall CPC trend, that's going to be a factor in what those numbers end up being. The core trends you can see here for impressions, clicks, and spending. We saw kind of similar impression and click growth, 19% year over year for impressions, 21% for clicks. If you can do the math, we'll see on the next slide, that means that click-through rate probably declined quarter over quarter because the impression growth was faster than the click growth. And on the spending side, we saw a 17% increase quarter over quarter. We saw a 12% increase year over year. That is a little bit faster than what we've been tracking the last several quarters. I think the last several have been between 10 and 11. So it's kind of at the top of that general range that we've been seeing over time. If we break down click-through rate and average CPC, you can see, as I mentioned, from Q3 to Q4, actually a 7% decline in click-through rate. And that is pretty typical for the season, because what happens in Q4 is we see a lot of impressions flooding the market. There are a lot of people searching. There are a lot of searches, and you know, every search has multiple impressions and only one typically click per results page. So as a result, impressions tend to grow faster than clicks in Q4, and that's what we saw here. So click-through rate behaves accordingly. And average CPC, as I alluded to earlier, down 8% year over year, flat quarter over quarter. And a lot of that is because we're seeing more and more of these lower priced mobile shopping campaign ads. The key drivers, kind of what I was hinting at before, you can see that mobile product ads increased 47% in spend year over year. If you break those down into mobile keywords, or if you compare those to mobile keywords, desktop product ads, you see that product ads in both cases showed strong growth, stronger on mobile than on desktop. And then mobile keywords, 13% increase, and desktop keywords, as we said before, that 1% increase, leading to the overall growth of 12% year over year in terms of search spend. This is not really surprising. This is similar to the trends we've been talking about for, you know, pretty much the last year plus. Mobile and product are big drivers on the search side. As to why that is and how it can continue, it's a combination of, you know, just smartphone volume growth is one component. If you look at time spent on mobile, that's another component. If you look at kind of the changing demographic of searchers as younger people who are kind of mobile native get into the market, they are more inclined to search for more things. And then, you know, as all of these things happen, people start to learn to turn to their phones and search for more things more often. So there are more instances of finding things to search for. And I think we're seeing all of those things help continue to push that mobile growth quarter after quarter after quarter. I want to go back to our key segments here. I've broken it up by keywords on desktops and smartphones, all of mobile, all of shopping campaigns, and then shopping campaigns on smartphones. And this is a little less dramatic than the social version of the chart, but you can see, you know, desktop keywords, as we said, have gotten a little more expensive. That bubble moves about, you know, 7 or 8 cents to the right. And you see smartphone keywords actually increasing in click-through rate, which is another interesting finding. There may be more to drill down into in that. It could be, you know, people are searching for different, as we get more attuned to what people search for on their phones, we are able to provide them with, you know, better things that are more in line with what it is they need in that moment. And, you know, as we as marketers get better at serving that need, we're going to be rewarded by people clicking on those ads. It's also interesting to note that the desktop keywords are the only of these segments that actually increased in CPC year over year. Drilling down a little bit into mobile share of total, and we've seen this for a while now, that mobile has been driving a higher share of clicks than either impressions or spending. But in both the case of clicks and impressions, we do live now in a, you know, smartphone mobile majority in terms of traffic there. So we're seeing the majority of impressions, the majority of clicks have been over on smartphones, even above 50% since Q2 of last year. And spend is creeping up. It was flat quarter over quarter. It's about 44% of total spend on mobile, and this is smartphone only. So if you include tablet in there, then it puts you over the top, and then you've got more than desktop. I think smartphones and desktop are about on parity. They're both around 44%, and then tablet makes up the balance. Actually, desktop might be a little bit higher. One thing that we've kind of gotten some visibility into this quarter that's new for this call is automated bidding. Kenshoo as a platform gives advertisers multiple ways that they can automate their bidding strategies for their search campaigns. One of the big ways is something we have called keyword portfolio optimization, and there are a couple other ways that you can do it as well. But if you kind of lump those all together into automated bidding as a bucket versus going in and manually changing your bids, you see that we've got about 35% year over year growth in spend that is doing that. This is separate from, say, Google Smart Bids. It's a similar idea, but it's stuff that we've been doing for quite some time. And this would be this is new for us again, as I mentioned. Ways that we might want to drill this down is to look at this by, you know, stratified by level of spend, because my suspicion would be this is something that larger advertisers are going to do more often than smaller advertisers. When you're operating at scale, you don't want to have to go in and manually change bids for hundreds, if not thousands of ad groups. So we're going to get to a quick little theme about advertising digitally at scale in a moment, but this is kind of one of the first shots fired in that direction. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about emerging channels. These are publishers that we have recently started working with and started managing spend on behalf of our clients. The first one I'm denoting it shorthand as e-commerce channel advertising, because when we talk about e-commerce advertising, we tend to think about e-commerce clients, and this is not. The platform is an e-commerce platform. The biggest one we know from announcements we've given and what we're doing is Amazon, but we want to kind of look at this as a broad category. Right now, we're talking primarily about advertising on Amazon. And what you see here is that the growth, the adoption of this, the amount of spending and impressions and clicks we've got going through our platform since we really kind of kicked this off back in July has been, it's been a pretty strong response. We see total monthly spending increasing nearly 3x from July through December. We see clicks increasing over 4x. So we're seeing lots of growth in interaction with these ads. We see November being strong. If again, Black Friday was in November, so that's kind of normal across the board that you see a little more activity going on in November than December. So we've seen strong response on the e-commerce, what we call the e-commerce product here at Kenshoo, and e-commerce channel advertising in general. Excuse me. Kind of talking a little bit about specific instances of success. We've got a couple of these in the pipeline, but for example, we've got Starcom and Performix here, and they were looking to drive increased awareness. They're looking to optimize their keywords and campaigns at scale and promote some of their product sales. We were able to give them an approach using our basically semantic layer over the system that help them group their products, that help them look at conversion windows, their budget pacing, give them insights into product eligibility, all of which help them drive higher ROI, better cost per acquisition, better cost per click. The main thing that I want you to take away from this is that advertisers want to advertise in e-commerce platforms at scale. So they're using our platform, they're using native tools, they're doing what they can to help scale up the advertising. This is consistent with the messaging we've seen externally with some of the projections about how much ad spend is going to go through these platforms. And the fact that we've got this client base who's kind of champing at the bit to rev up their spending is kind of evidence of that. Similarly, we're seeing good uptake on Pinterest. You see that nice sharp increase from Q3 to Q4. So holiday spending seemed to be in full effect this year, rather than just kind of a continuation of the linear growth that we saw from the quarters before that. So spending grew 51% over the previous quarter and at least 3x since the beginning of the year, since we started kind of getting a more stable data set. So Pinterest also, something that advertisers are responding to. They're trying to get in. We've got another success story here. And again, a big part of this is about scale. So this is Bellicor with their agency Effective Spend, really looking to scale Pinterest advertising across a large quantity of products. And so, we can help them with automating their campaign building, with their reporting, with bid and budget optimization, and they got really strong results. But again, the moral of the story across some of these emerging channels is that advertisers want to spend money on them, and they want to spend money on them at levels similar to what they see in other platforms. So encouraging signs on both. I will give kind of a cautionary tale about looking at numbers from some of these platforms, and that is we're still figuring out what's an apple and what's an orange. So even with search and social, we kind of make a couple of judgment calls where we'll compare two things that may not be defined exactly the same way. And that starts to increase exponentially when we start to look at these. So if you've got access to data and you're looking at, for example, social click-through rate versus e-commerce click-through rate, there may be kind of fundamental structural things that you need to be aware of when you're doing that. So I advise caution when you kind of directly compare some of those metrics. It's one of the reasons we use things like CPM and CTR, because they're kind of their lowest common denominators in a lot of ways. They're not necessarily the best way to do it, but they're the way that we have available. That concludes the formal content that we've got prepared for you. I'm going to now take a peek at the questions pane and see what we've got. Let me toggle that out. We've got a question about ROI on advertising, Amazon advertising. Kind of what I just said. That's an area where I do not want to get into the apples to oranges comparison. Social in particular is a little sticky on ROI for me personally. So we will not be talking that much about ROI yet until I look at it. Some of these I will have to email you because I don't have them in front of me. So if I don't get to your question, have a little faith, I'll try to get to it. There's some stuff about social spend growth earlier. And let's see. Is the ramp in e-commerce channel advertising in your data a result of Kenshoo initiatives, or is this purely the increased interest usage of these platforms? It's going to be a combination of both. Obviously, there's been momentum among advertisers who have already been spending, irrespective of our role in the process. So that was happening already. We're just, hoping to make it easier for people. So it's going to be a combination of both. So let's see. So again, if you'd like to ask some questions, you can do so. Is social spend on Black Friday an indicator of sales and conversion rate results also? To a gentleman who has left the conference. I think so, yes. Again, conversion and sales data, I'll give you a little bit of inside baseball on that. The way that a lot of online tracking systems and campaign management tracking systems work, you can kind of define a conversion or a sale as whatever you want. So there's not necessarily consistency between multiple clients as to what they call a conversion. But if we kind of take steps to corral that, I think, yeah, we do see Black Friday having a strong Black Friday, or we see social having a strong Black Friday on the conversion front as well. To the extent that I can come up with defensible data on that, we may publish a broader holiday report in the next week or two. That's still TBD, though. Somebody asked about commentary on Instagram stories. One of the things this quarter, I tried to kind of simplify a lot of the slides. One of my somebody up the food chain pointed out that I was at like 75 slides at 4:30 yesterday. So I took some stuff out. Instagram stories was one of them. I think it was probably about it's been definitely growing as a percent of overall Instagram spend. I think it's above, I want to say 12%, but that might be Instagram as a percent of total. It might be, anyway, I'll get back to you on that. Someone asked about Snapchat, if there's a reason we didn't discuss it. It's just there's not a lot. We don't have real critical mass on it. It's like if I were going to talk about it, it would be that app installs are still one of the best use cases of it. We all know that Snapchat's been kind of reformulating a lot of its offering. And as they do that, it makes what we have to look at less useful, because stuff that happened, 6 months ago is no longer really applicable anyway. So as we get better visibility in Snapchat, we'll start talking about it again, but it just didn't make sense to do that this time around. Here's the question I knew I was going to get, and I'm somewhat prepared for. Thoughts on Facebook's recent change to the news feed and the impact on spending trends? I'm going to give you an educated, we don't know. There is a Wired.com interview with I think he's the vice president of newsfeed at Facebook, where he explicitly says that these changes have nothing to do with the advertising ecosystem, which on the one hand is true. They're not changing what ads you do and you don't see. The question here, and the thing that everyone's kind of curious to see how it shakes out, is what the impact will be on both the content providers who may not be showing up in news feeds anymore, and then Facebook users and what they do if they do want that content that's not in their news feed anymore. For example, are content providers going to buy more ads? That would be kind of good for spending. On the other hand, are consumers going to go directly to the source to get this information, which would be bad for, you know, time spent on the platform? Sorry, talking for an hour apparently dries out your throat. Who knew? So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And the other thing is, even if time spent declines on a per user basis, we're kind of beyond the point where we're just going after reach on Facebook. We're going after, you know, specific audiences and specific targeting to a level that when you're there in that reduced time that you're spending, you're still probably going to see that ad. So, you know, that would minimize that effect as well, I think. On the other hand, could that make us reach that kind of limit of ad load faster? I don't know. So these are kind of the things that are in play with that. So nobody really knows how it's going to play out. We're all going to be watching it, and hopefully we'll have something next quarter that may or may not give us more insight into it. So what do you see as a strong brand awareness ad type on social, given that overall impressions are decreasing? I mean, video is still going to be higher on the brand awareness side. It's definitely lower on the click-through side, so that's not really any different. I think it's going to be things that are not dynamic ads, for one, and carousel ads. But Canvas was always a thing. We didn't really call that out this time because the trends among Canvas ads are a little trickier for me to tease out of the data. But with all of these platforms, it's always an evolution. Facebook is, you know, tweaking things on a regular basis to try to fit certain paradigms, and they've got their whole, you know, goals for what they want advertisers to do. And I think, you know, branding is always going to be a piece of it, so they're always going to be tuning for that as well. I have a question about search and spend for the first couple weeks in January. I do not have any data on that. I won't for a while because I'm going to go have a drink after this, I think, and just kind of, it's been a lot of work putting this together for you guys. I hope you all appreciate that. Is the growth in social video at ad spend at the expense of YouTube spend, or is it additive? Can't see that. I do not have visibility into YouTube ad spending, so I'm sorry, we can't answer that question. Let's see, I'm trying to see if there's anything else I can talk about. Is CTR still a main metric on these channels, or is post-view tracking on the rise? Any trends? This is tricky. This is what I was getting at with the apples and oranges talk, and that is that particular, what was I going to say? Sorry, lost my train of thought. At an individual level, advertisers are going to have their own KPIs and their own way of looking at things and their own way of figuring out whether or not they're being successful. In aggregate, that becomes very difficult because it's hard to get visibility into, oh, this one's looking for cost per acquisition. This one's looking at lifetime value. So as a result, I'm stuck with fairly rudimentary metrics as kind of an ad hoc comparison between them. I think certainly at the individual advertiser level, we are way beyond click-through rate. I mean, just search when it got started, you know, 20 years ago with GoTo.com and Overture and all that stuff. The whole point was that it was getting beyond click-through rate and getting to actual conversion rates and ROI. So I think at the advertiser level, yes, we are getting beyond click-through rate. But at the aggregate level, it still tends to be the lowest common denominator, so we still default to it. So that's my little spiel on that. Let's see. I will answer some of these in email after that. We are kind of at the top of the hour. So I would like to thank you all for your time. You can download the materials. You've got my contact information if you've got more questions. So yeah, that's it. This has been the Q4 Kenshoo Quarterly Trends webinar, and thanks for coming. We'll see you next time.